I'll start as I started, I start all my life acknowledging Aboriginal people who've mentored me, who've guided me through some difficult times and who've shared with me all sorts of experiences in generous ways, acknowledging the Dja Dja Wurrung in particular. As the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability, I always acknowledged Aboriginal people as being a guide to us about sustainable best practice, and there might be some debates. There might be some debates about that. Let's see. How's that? Oh, that's better, isn't it? Okay, let me start again then. I'm acknowledging the Dja Dja Wurrung. I'm acknowledging Aboriginal people for their sustainable best practice. As the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability, I did that all over Victoria. I'm also, as the retired or resigned Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability, going to acknowledge Aboriginal people for one other thing here today, and I've been doing this increasingly. And it's acknowledging them for the fact that they demonstrate to us how you can deal with rapid, unwelcome change and how you can somehow come through it. How somehow the struggle teaches us other things, other skills, and sustains us in what we might describe as the battle. Rapid, unwelcome change is what we're looking at with climate change. There's no doubt that that's what we're looking at, and there's no doubt that it's more rapid than we thought it was. And if you want to go no further than just look at what the Obama administration's scientific panels produced recently, you'll be pretty concerned about the issue. And I'm sure that's why you're all here at 8:30 in the morning on a cold Bendigo day. The reality is that rapid unwelcome change is going to impact people in all sorts of ways across this state and across the world. We know, for instance, that there's going to be really significant implications for people in the Pacific Islands, just to start with. We know that people who live in places like Chittagong are going to have to deal with these issues. But for us, for what's happening here, it's significant that the people who are going to struggle with these issues will be those who are the most vulnerable. There's no doubt about that too. I remember vividly having a conversation with Sandra Bailey, a Yorta woman who was in fact the first graduate of the Melbourne University Law Faculty in the 1980s, about what climate change meant for Aboriginal people here in Australia. And she made the point to me that it's all very well for us to use the grab bag phrases and think about the jargon and worry about the acronyms, but if you're a kid who's going to school in Walgett and it's 49 degrees when you get home, you're not going to be terribly worried about the maladaptive practice of turning on the air conditioning to do your homework. And it's true. There's going to be lots of things that we do that aren't necessarily the best practice in response to these particular challenges, and we need government to show leadership. We need government to assist us with the regulatory frameworks that's going to produce best outcomes, and we need to meet them and meet them generously along the way and make our contribution. And for those like me who come from what I might describe as a middle class or upper middle class background, the burden is on us to do the best we can. From the point of view of what people are doing, can I say this? As the Commissioner, Aboriginal people had taught me that it was important to get out and ask people what it was they thought were the issues, and we did just exactly that. In talking to my young public servants, I know that they were absolutely horrified when I said we'd be doing some field work, and I was the person who probably liked the idea most. But that's what we did. Throughout the whole time of my Commissioner role, we visited people. We visited them in places like the Oyen Health Service and the Orbost Neighbourhood House. We visited people in places like Kurrambara. We went up to Corryong and spoke to people about the blackberry control program, which suddenly morphed into something other than a discussion about blackberries. On the bus going around the region, people talked about what they were doing about blackberries, and they talked about solar panels, and they talked about climate change, and they talked about how they'd changed their cropping regimes, and they talked about being innovators, and they said they needed to be. And in Corryong in particular, they said they needed to be because it wasn't until 2003 that they even felt the pressure of a drought, and they asked themselves why that might be. We spoke to little kids in places like the Middle Kinglake Primary School, and those little kids had rebuilt their school with the teachers and with the funding and with all the other things that meant that it was possible to do. But they lost their garden in the fires and they rebuilt it. We talked to kids down at places like Narrawong, which is a school that's just backing onto the primary dune near Port Fairy. And it's pretty obvious that in relation to what we're going to see about sea level rise, that school's probably in jeopardy. We talk to men and women all over the place. We talk to farmers, we talk to agriculturalists, we talk to people who wanted to tell us about no-till farming in places like Horsham. We talked to people who wanted the Wimmera River to become a heritage river. And everywhere we went, people talked to us about climate change. They might not have come along to those particular sessions to talk about climate change, but the discussion became that. And it didn't become that because I guided it. It became that because this is the issue that confronts us and compels us to think about the environment in all sorts of really, really graphic ways. From the point of view of talking here today, the title, and I welcome you all being here because I wouldn't have come out to hear a person talk about the burden of things and compensation from a lawyer. I welcome you for being here. But the title is probably a bit fraudulent. Frankly, compensation is something that we all need to think about for the environment as well as for human beings. We know that what we're going to see with climate change is the creep of the snow level. We know we're going to see migratory birds for whom we celebrated the Migratory Birds Day yesterday. We know we're going to see them falling out of the sky because they leave when it's warmer and don't arrive when it's cooler. We know we're going to see those sorts of changes. We know that the environment is going to suffer and struggle with climate change. We know that this is a dry continent and we know it's going to get worse. We know we're going to see more droughts. We know we're going to see them more often. We know we're going to see more fires and we know we're going to see them more often. And I frankly don't care for the conversation that suggests that isn't the case because it's wrong. We know that what we're seeing here in Australia is change already. We know that that's being reflected in the good scientific communication around the world, and we know we need to be part of it. So when I talk about compensation, we know that we need to look after the environment, and it in fact needs to be compensated by us remedying how we act now. In terms of compensation though for us, if we lose our capacity to have fresh air, we know what happens in places like the Latrobe Valley recently. If we lose our capacity to drink clean water, we know what that will mean for us. These are ecosystem services that are provided by an environment that's under threat and pressure. If we don't have bees out there pollinating crops, it's not just about whether we get to put honey on our toast, it's about the way in which we can eat. We know, and there's recent science about this, that in fact climate change is affecting the amount of iron in the grains that we eat. We know that that is going to impact on us. I trust the scientific judgment on these matters because it's been delivered to me and to all of you through experiment, hypothesis, critical self-examination and feedback loops. I know, and you would have heard people talk about science, probably from the denialist point of view, that in fact scientists have felt themselves under threat. All around Victoria, all we heard about scientists from people was that they did good work and were useful and that people trusted them. We heard it about agricultural scientists in particular from agriculturalists, but we know that that is in fact how people think about what the science is out there in what I might describe as the regions. We also know that that's what we're finding in places like Melbourne and cities like Bendigo and places like Portland. I was astonished to come to Bendigo some many months ago and be told that there were 600 sustainability groups in this town. Now there are apparently, I can hardly believe it, but there are. I was astonished to be down in a place like Portland. I couldn't meet with the sustainability group there on the occasion I was there and I came back on another day. And they told me about some work they'd done because whilst recycling televisions might not seem to be a climate change response, that was what they were doing because they could see all of the connections. They could see the feedback loops, they could see the concerns, they could see the ways that they could interact with the issues and they could see how they could change the trajectory. In Portland, they didn't get government funding to recycle the televisions that we were all chucking out and leaving on the sidewalks. They thought nevertheless that they would do something about it and they decided to advertise in the local paper for people to bring their televisions down to a dump site where they would then take them to Hamilton. They got the ad for free, as I understand it, in the local paper. They got the Rotary group to provide them with their 6-foot by 4-foot trailer and they thought that they would put the televisions on that and take them up to Hamilton. They waited for the televisions to start arriving. And 26 tonnes of televisions later, they realised that the 6-foot by 4-foot trailer was not going to be adequate to the task. And the people who assisted them to move those televisions were the local logistics firm, which provided 2 B-doubles to take the televisions where they needed to go, and provided the front end loader to put the B-doubles into those, to put the televisions into those B-doubles. They then, because they are even smarter than that, said to themselves, well, if we take them to Hamilton, that's just a staging post for the real recycling, let's take them to Warrnambool. And they cut out the middleman yet again and got rid of some additional carbon miles by simply taking the televisions to Warrnambool. My point is that people aren't waiting for lawyers like me to tell us how we're going to compensate people for the things that need to happen to deal with climate change, or environmental degradation, or our recycling challenges, or the way we think that growth is the answer and that we waste things. People are out there doing that themselves. They're already out there doing it, and they're doing it everywhere. They're doing it in places like Euroa, where I live, where we are revegetating the Sevens Creek. We're doing it notwithstanding the council, or some members of the council think that we're wasting our time. We're doing it on Sunday mornings, and the group that comes along is young people, old people, retirees, people who bring along their walking frames, and the middle class like me, who were a Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability, and you would expect to see me there. People are coming from all over the place to do this work, and they know that it's important. In revegetating the Sevens Creek, we're not saying to ourselves that we are dealing with climate change or compensating ourselves for what needs to be done. We're saying that it's about having an environment that's sustainable, that's going to be producing fresh air, clean water, and the potential for us to pollinate our crops in particular. But less specifically, it's about how we think we want to live in this country. I have a great tenderness for Australia. My family in various stages arrived here in the 1830s, and I've got members of my family who are down there at Sandridge who were moving the Bunurong off their traditional lands. I've travelled across the country in all sorts of ways and all sorts of places, and as a little kid at the age of 16 I rode some horses from Hay, or Burke, from Burke through the Hay Plains to Melbourne with my older brother who's since passed away. You don't get to see the country much slower than that, and I can tell you it was hot, it was midsummer. I have a tenderness for this country notwithstanding I've got an Irish skin and I burn badly. And the tenderness I have for this country is that it's ours. It's a place that in many ways nourishes and nurtures us. Generously sometimes, less generously in others. But it's a place that I care about. It's a place that in many respects has made me the person that I am, and no doubt has made all of you the people that you are. If we lose it, and your grandchildren, and I don't have children so I won't be having grandchildren, and your children and grandchildren don't have the potential to explore this country in that way, I think our souls lose something. And I'm not a Christian, but there's something about our souls that lose something. So we can talk about compensation, and as a lawyer we can worry about whether we do it by way of a Supreme Court writ where we say that our stated compensation claim is X amount of dollars, or we can talk about it in different ways. And we can talk about what we lose by not nurturing the country or allowing it at its best and even at its worst to nurture us. It's a complex undertaking. It's full of feedback loops, it's full of ways in which we don't understand, and in fact in the time that I was the Commissioner, there's some passages of reports that I'm particularly proud of that explain this. I'm going to read a page or a few paragraphs that tell me why I think this is important. And it actually has nothing to do with, you would think, the environment or climate change as it starts to unfold. We were in Gippsland. I know the Wanron prison from being a solicitor and acting for Aboriginal people over many years. We went to the place that is now Walgungu Nalu. It's a learning place, and it's a place where programs for personal and environmental sustainability unfold under the supervision of Indigenous mentors and managers, and those people were Sean Braybrook and Shane Charles. That stuff unfolds in a physical structure that is in fact an environmentally sustainable building. The building has met a number of stars from the point of view of green building, and to that extent it's wonderful. Physically, what we brought away from that particular visit was a jam jar, because they gave me a jam jar that they'd filled with some jam they'd made themselves, the prisoners, and a boomerang. The boomerang was given to me by a young Aboriginal bloke there, and there's a photo in the particular report which you may or may not want to go to. I'm just going to read to you what I said about what I think is in fact one of the ways we need to reflect on all these issues. This boomerang was presented to us by a young Indigenous man, Justin McGurgan, who's now deceased. Justin, in the company of Shane Charles, appears in a photograph on the front cover of this report, and that's the Many Publics report. I acknowledge his gift, the goodwill in its giving, the links this gifting forged, and as is appropriate, I pay my respects. I thank Justin's mother, Debbie, for permission to use the photograph. Before we published this particular report, I was lucky enough to get Debbie McGurgan's phone number from Shane Charles, and that's about relationships, trust and connectivity. And I rang Debbie and I said that I would like to use the photograph. She said to me that she would be honoured if we did. I also told her that before I would publish this report publicly, I would bring her a copy of it and she would see it before anybody else did. That's what I did. Going on from what I've written here. In keeping with what we've heard from people all over the state engaged in a conversation about sustainability and the cyclical nature of environmental best practice, I just want to linger on the symbolism of that gift, the boomerang. The boomerang speaks of much more than its shape or the substance from which it's carved. Simple and highly sophisticated, a boomerang offers up an understanding of that returning or cyclical nature of a life lived in the environment. On one level, it's an implement used to achieve an outcome, and that outcome is sustenance. On another level, it returns, and in returning, it fulfills the cycle of consumption, survival, and replenishment. Justin's gift from a member of the oldest living culture to us, and that was my team, embarked as we were on environmental reporting for other and newer cultures in this landscape, reminds us and reminds me of the importance of connection. In the gifting, this boomerang embodies the quest for sustainable or renewable outcomes, the collaborations and the participation upon which outcomes are based, and fundamentally, it encourages better attempts at plain speaking across complex terrain. I've written a lot of stuff in my life. I'm probably happiest with those few paragraphs. And the reason that those paragraphs really continue to speak to me, no matter how often I read them, no matter how often I reflect on them, is because they keep reminding me about the complexity, and they keep reminding me about the connectivity, and they reinforce the fact that this has got to be about participation. So if I was to say what we need to do from the point of view of compensation in relation to climate change, it's this. We need to share our knowledge. We need to do it with respect and responsibility. We need to go back constantly. We need to understand there'll be feedback loops. We need to know that there'll be people who disagree with us. We need nevertheless to listen to what they have to say as best we can and as respectfully as we can. And then we need to make sure that we bring pressure to bear on those who can do more than us about these issues. Finally, let me say, in being a lawyer, there is nothing I like better than a well-crafted sentence, and sometimes I like them with lots of subclauses and commas. But I learnt a lot in this job. I learnt a lot from people on the ground. I learnt from people like Justin McGurgan and the generosity of his mother Debbie. And I learnt from people who have nothing to do with any of that. I learnt from people who understand that we need to think visually. We need to say to lawyers like me, cut the garbage with the language and get down to what it looks like. Get down to thinking about how this is going to be presented to people to get an impact and get people engaged so they bring pressure to bear on those who can make change at those high government levels. So, I'm here today to say that I learned a lot in the job as the Commissioner. It was a gift. It was one of the hardest jobs I've ever done, but it was a gift. And it was a gift for those two reasons. People's public participation and what I learnt about not being a lawyer. And I'm happy to take any questions.